Oi, boa tarde a todo mundo que está acompanhando mais uma live, mais uma conferência do Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação da UNISINOS, Universidade do Vale do Rio dos Sinos, organizada pelos grupos de pesquisa DigiLabour, TCAV, CultPop e LIC, que são os grupos de pesquisa que estão organizando este evento. Meu nome é Rafael Groma, sou coordenador do Laboratório DigiLabour, e eu primeiro dou um oi para a professora Adriana Amaral, coordenadora do CultPop. Oi, Adriana.
Oi, tudo bem, Rafael? Hello, Catherine, how are you?
Hello, oi, tudo bem?
Bem, hoje a gente vai receber aqui a professora Catherine Denasso, que é diretora do Data Plus Feminism Lab e é professora de Ciências Urbanas e Planejamento no MIT, no Departamento de Estudos de Urbanismo e Planejamento, e tem estudado de maneiras criativas como democratizar a ciência de dados para a justiça social, e é uma das autoras, junto com Lauren Klein, do livro Data Feminism. So, Catherine, thank you for having us today, and welcome virtually to Brazil.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and virtually in Brazil. I wish I could really go to Brazil. In fact, I want to tell you, I don't speak Portuguese, but I have family who live in São Paulo, so I was just visiting them like a year and a half ago. I went to my cousin's wedding there. So.
Okay, Catherine, your microphone is with buzz. I don't know.
You want me to? Okay, let me try different.
If you can put off and on.
Oh, I know. Wait, headphones. Okay, wait. Let me just try. How's this? Does this sound a little bit better?
Yeah.
Yeah? Good?
Yeah. The floor is yours.
Okay, awesome. All right, so let's get started. I'm going to talk a little bit today about Lauren Klein and I's book called Data Feminism, which we published last year, just came out right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I want to talk a little bit about the motivations for writing data feminism, the kind, like what we mean by feminism, so the kind of the definition of feminism that we're using in the book. And I want to show you a couple of examples that come from the book, which will give you a sense of what we're trying to do there. So we see data feminism as part of a growing body of work that's really working to hold corporate and government actors accountable for making racist, sexist, classist data products. So I don't know how new or not these things are to folks on this call, but these things are things like face detection systems that can't see women of color, hiring algorithms that demote applicants that went to all women's schools, search algorithms that circulate negative stereotypes about Black girls, and so many more things. And so like almost every day, there's a new sort of example of algorithmic bias coming out in the popular press. And the fact that these examples really keep coming, and the press keeps like throwing up its hands and being like, oh my God, algorithmic bias. This is in a sense what motivated us to write the book. Because on the one hand, we have folks in, especially corporations, sometimes in government, spreading what are essentially memes, like the one that you see here. This is this data is the new oil. So I don't know how many folks have heard this. This is, we call it a meme because this has been circulating, at least in the US and sort of like Silicon Valley type context for almost 15 years at this point. And the main folks who are saying and heralding data is the new oil, they mean this in a good way. And by which they mean, you know, and the metaphors here are very interesting as well, because whereas oil is an extractive industry, we actually also use a lot of extractive metaphors to talk about data. So if we can mine data appropriately, if we can extract data, if we can tap data resources, if we can clean and process data correctly, all of these, we can then kind of take this quote unquote raw material that's just out there existing and then convert it into profit. And so that's what they mean when they're saying data is the new oil. Folks like The Economist magazine and these CEOs mean there's huge potential for money and profit. But along with the rise of this meme has been a growing pushback. And the meme for the pushback is essentially what is here on the slide, is that data is the same old oppression. And we would situate our work as part of this growing pushback. And this is being led by Black and Indigenous women of color, by white women, by Indigenous folks, by immigrants, LGBTQ folks, and more, because they're articulating to us how, in fact, there's really nothing all that new about our data-driven systems. In fact, what they've just enabled us to do is to accelerate and exacerbate the same old systems of domination and oppression that have existed for decades, if not longer. And they say that and do that in various ways. You can see here at the bottom of the slide are some of our favorite examples of work in this vein, which is coming from academia, it's coming from journalists, it's coming from artists and poets and creative workers and educators and many more. And so the fact that this work is growing is really exciting. Yet at the same time, the pushing back and speaking out about this idea of data kind of enacting the same old oppression carries consequences. And so I just wanted to call your all's attention to this case of Dr. Timnit Gebru, which I would encourage everybody to go look up. Until recently, she was the co-lead of the ethical artificial intelligence team at Google. She's widely known, she's very famous, she's very high profile, she's a machine vision scholar. She's also an organizer. She co-founded the Black in AI community. And she was recently fired from Google for questioning. So she and her colleagues put in a research paper to a conference, which is as part of her work as a research scientist. Google had approved the research paper, the conference approved the research paper, and then all of a sudden Google reversed their decision and they said, you need to retract this research paper. She pushed back and she asked for transparency, and then Google promptly fired her for that, in addition to her work questioning how slowly they were moving on efforts of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so her case is really interesting and has provoked a very huge and high-profile backlash. So 2,500 Google employees have signed a petition supporting transparency for Dr. Gebru. It's that same petition's been signed by 5,000 folks outside of Google, academics and researchers primarily. 9 members of US Congress actually wrote a letter to Google demanding accountability, but there's still no answer. And so my colleagues and I, Dr. Turner and Dr. Wood and I, have recently written a piece in this State of AI Ethics report, which I would encourage you to look at, because what we're trying to do here is say, what happened to her is egregious, but it's also not isolated. And so it's such a common centuries-old playbook against Black women that, there's actually this kind of cycle for how these stories unfold. And we try to place this in historical relief and show how people in power are threatened by Black women who speak truth to that power. So why does this case matter for AI and for computer science and for data science? So feminism as both a theory and a practice demands that we ask what we call in the book who questions. And so these are uncomfortable questions a lot of the times, but these are questions like data science by whom? So who are the workers who are doing data science? It's meaningful, for example, that like 1% of AI researchers are Black women, and like 12% of AI researchers are women at all. Data science for whom? So for whose benefit? You know, The Economist magazine would have it be for the benefit of the global corporations, but like who are we building these technologies for? Data sets about whom? So when we are collecting data, using data to fuel our products and our systems, who are those data about? Whose lives are caught up in those data? And then when we do data science, we do it with whose values? Whose values are at the core of the decisions that we make about data science? Lauren and I's contribution is really to bring this intersectional feminist lens into this conversation and try to connect much of the work that feminists have done over many, many decades to dissect and analyze and challenge power to our contemporary conversations about data science. But here, feminism means a lot of different things to different people. So we like to spend a couple of minutes just doing some level setting about the term feminists and feminism. So what you see here is an image from the 2014 MTV Music Awards when Beyonce, who's here, projected the word feminist behind her. And in the same song where she was singing, she actually is quoting the dictionary definition of what is a feminist. So a feminist is the person who believes in equal rights for men and women and non-binary people. So what we get from this definition is that feminism is a belief, first and foremost. But then secondly, if we believe that all of the genders are equal, then all you have to do is look around at your world and you can see that that equality has not been realized in this present world. And so that also implies a commitment to take action to realize the world in which equality on behalf of all the genders is realized. So feminism is also this commitment to action. It's organized activity on behalf of women's and non-binary people's rights and interests. So it's a belief, it's political action. And then finally and thirdly, and I think very excitingly, feminism is also a set of theories and ideas. And what this means is that it's an intellectual heritage. So it's folks that we can look to when we are facing present struggles, and we can look at their work and see what it has to offer us to navigate these current struggles. And so feminism as a theory, as a set of theories and ideas, begins by thinking through issues of equality with respect to sex and gender. But then the past 40 years of scholarship and also our current political reality have brought many more dimensions of inequality into the conversation, including race, class, sexuality, ability, and many more things. So this leads to this kind of most important takeaway from this definitional section, which is that we say in the book that feminism, especially in the year 2020, must be understood as intersectional. And so I don't know you all, I don't know how new or not new that term is for you, but I will just define it just in case. So intersectionality is a term coined by Kimberly Crenshaw, who that's her here on the bottom right. And she's a legal scholar. And she uses intersectionality to explain how we can't explain social inequality by looking at only one dimension of difference, like gender. So when we talk about inequality or oppression, we have to talk about the intersection of the forces and factors that produce it. So including sexism, certainly, but also racism, classism, colonialism, imperialism, and so on. And she's writing specifically from a Black feminist tradition, which also comes out of work like the Combahee River Collective, which is depicted here as well, and Black and women of color feminists who have, in a sense, always insisted that it cannot only be about gender equality without also racial equality, without also class inequality, without also sort of sexual liberation and freedom for LGBTQ folks, and so on. And so sort of the idea is that we look at those multiple axes of inequality and need to consider them at every stage. And so the takeaway here is that, an intersectional approach to feminism is not only about women, it's not even only about gender, but it's really about power. It's about who has power and who doesn't have power. Today, in today's world, data is power. And you can see this in that idea of data is the new oil. You see that in this like very just material sense of like, who are the companies who are making the most money right now? They are the Googles and the Microsofts and the whatevers that are making their money from collecting, storing, analyzing, deploying large amounts of data. So if data is power, if data is power, then our essential argument of the book is that intersectional feminism, when applied to data science, can help that power be challenged and changed. And in fact, our argument is that data science needs feminism, and it particularly needs intersectional feminism, if we ever hope to overturn any of these power imbalances. As we wrote the book, Lauren and I looked across a lot of different fields. I mean, one of the most exciting things actually about feminist work is it has happened in many different fields. So like everything from legal scholarship and economics and international relations to design disciplines, human-computer interaction, geography, certainly the humanities, literary scholarship, creative work, the arts. Like there's feminist work across all of these areas. And so we tried to look across as much as we could. And we came up with these 7 principles that for us encapsulate the most important aspects of feminism as they relate to data practices and to data science. And so the goal here was not to necessarily make new theory per se, but more to think about, well, how do we draw from existing feminist theory to provide models for how we may work with data in more justice-oriented and more liberatory ways. And so these are the 7 principles. And this is actually also the way that the book is structured. So each of these principles corresponds to a chapter. And the other thing we did in the book is we're trying to write to essentially an audience of newcomers. So we don't assume that people already know about data science. We also don't assume that people already know about feminism. So in each chapter, we're trying to introduce folks to some of the major feminist thinkers who have come up with essentially these principles, even though they can say them in the same way necessarily. So we introduce you to them. And then we also introduce you to folks who are working with data and data science to actually do the principles. Because when we start looking around, in fact, there are powerful models that are working in these more liberatory ways. We just often have to look outside the silos of computer science or academia to actually find them and value them. So I'm going to show a couple examples. I won't be able to talk about all of the principles today, but maybe just the one thing I'll draw your attention to here is that there are the first 2 chapters have to do with power, examine power and challenge power. And that is in a sense what, as I defined with the intersectional feminism being about power, this is really the heart of the feminist project. So sometimes when we have given these talks, especially in more technical spaces, folks have asked us, well, why is it feminist versus just being good data science practices? And this is sort of the preemptive answer to that, which is that examining power and challenging power, and by power we mean forces of oppression, like racism and sexism, looking directly at those, taking those as the object of study and change as part of your data science project. That's what's at the heart of it. And that might be part of, I mean, I hope that becomes one of the, good data science practices. But as of right now, this kind of examination of power and the ways to challenge power, and in fact, any discussion of power is not part of your like traditional computer science and AI curriculum. So it's not part of just like good old normal data science at this stage, but maybe in the future. Okay. So I'm going to now just show you a couple of examples that will show you the range of work that we try to feature in the book as a way of introducing some of these principles. So we talk about projects like this one. This is actually an art project by the artist Mimi Onwoka. And this is a project called the Library of Missing Data Sets. And so this is a term coined by Onwoka. And this idea of missing data sets describes data sets that a reasonable person might expect to exist because they address issues of pressing social need. But in fact, these data sets do not actually exist. So things like trans people killed or injured in instances of hate crime, or people excluded from public housing because of criminal records, or in the United States context, a gender and race breakdown of the number of people getting vaccinated for COVID in the United States. So Onwoka exhibits this. So basically she keeps this list of missing data sets as a GitHub repository. So it's just a simple list. And then she exhibits them in an art installation, which you can see here. She exhibits this filing cabinet, and somebody can come and they can page through these files. And on the top of each individual folder is the sort of category of missing data. So things like trans people killed or injured in hate crimes. And then you can even take out the file folders, but then of course you open them and they are empty because they are data that nobody has collected. And so in a sense with this project, she's pointing to the reasons that nobody has collected these data. And nobody has collected these data because of this profound imbalance of power with respect to data collection in the world today. So if we think about it, data, despite what people say about them being in the cloud, they're very expensive, right, to collect. They're very expensive to store, maintain, and so on. When an institution decides to collect data, that represents an allocation of resources. It also represents a kind of a political decision. And larger institutions have this power to collect data. More often than not, minoritized groups do not. And so what's kind of being pointed out here is that we talk a lot about bias in algorithms or bias in data sets that we've all already collected. This is important, but it's also important to think about what are the data that we don't have because we haven't we don't have the political will or the resources to actually be collecting that data. So like that bias starts long before we end up with some biased algorithm. It starts in those decisions about how we allocate our resources and what we choose to track and measure. Another case, in fact, of missing data is the example of feminicide. In Mexico, as we talk about it here, but feminicide is a global, worldwide phenomenon. And this comes out of the chapter where we're talking about ways to use data science to challenge power. And so in the book, we tell the story of Maria Salguero, who resolved to head straight towards this problem of missing data and collect it herself. So for those of you who don't know, feminicides are gender-related killings of women and girls. They include cis and trans women. They've been legally defined as crimes, and primarily actually a lot of Latin American countries, And that's really due to the strength of the Latin American feminist movement of like really putting that on the public agenda. However, in most places, the state, even though the state has defined feminicide as a crime, it does not systematically collect data on feminicide. Like there's no mechanism for measuring, tabulating, retraining medical examiners and police and folks like that to actually classify these deaths properly. So the fact that the state sort of neglects to measure and neglects to care is the subject of emerging public anger in Latin America, and you can go check out the Ni Una Menos hashtag there. And so Maria Salguero was frustrated by this, and starting about 5 years ago, she started compiling these deaths herself. So by reading news reports, going through news coverage of violent death, which you can imagine is not pleasant to read, she spends 2 to 4 hours a day of reading about feminicide and then logging them in her database and on her Google map and classifying the data in various ways. And so because she's been doing this for this long, she has actually amassed the largest public archive available of feminicide data for Mexico. And she's an interesting case because she resists to be even labeled as an activist. She just, she's a person basically. But using her database, she's helped families to locate loved ones. She's provided data to journalists and NGOs. She's testified actually in front of Mexico's Congress multiple times. And so in the book, we talk about this as what might be called feminist counter data. So it is a kind of activist data collection that steps in when the state and other institutions have systematically failed to ensure the basic safety of their population. And so this idea of counter data represents one way to use data to challenge power. There is an important caveat there, which I think is important to say, which is that, of course, the answer to any problem of social inequality is not necessarily go collect more data, right? Particularly when those data may be about populations that are marginalized, populations that will be put in danger by being made visible to a state or to a powerful institution. So those are, in the book we talk about data as a double-edged sword, and that really applies here to determine whether counter data is the right strategy. But it does represent a kind of important and growingly used tool in the toolbox of folks who are looking to challenge power with data. Okay, just going to briefly here pass through this one. Yeah. I just want to talk briefly about the principle of embracing pluralism. So, a lot of times data science projects are conceived of, or we think about data science projects being in research labs undertaken by specialists. But in fact, the principle embrace pluralism is thinking about how do we bring the participation of many more people into a data science project, into a data science process, into the building and development of these tools and technologies. And so what might that look like? So following the work of Sandra Harding, Patricia Hill Collins, Shaolin Barzel, a feminist design perspective takes power into account and thinks about not only product, not only how can we make a feminist AI or how can we make a feminist visualization, but also process. So how do we build a strong and inclusive process for the development of these sort of technological artifacts? And feminist design has a really clear answer too for who should be participating and how they might participate in these processes. And so the work of the folks that I mentioned would say we prioritize the participation of people who have been most marginalized by the system. Meaning, in a typical design process, let's say you're building some website or whatever, You probably have a short period of time. You can kind of quickly do a little bit of user research, and maybe you capture the experiences of people who are here in the middle. They represent a kind of like majority of experiences. They might be your friends that you press into service to like fill out your user study or something like this. And then that's who we end up designing a lot of these things for. Whereas a feminist design process would actually say where we need to be is allocating time in the process and resources for the participation of people who have been marginalized by the system, people who are pushed out for various different reasons. And that's who we should be working hard to build relationships with and build accountability structures so that we might work with them in ethical ways. And so this is really similar to the design justice. I don't know if folks have heard of this amazing book and also this network of designers who are thinking about how to do justice-oriented design. They have a similar principle, which is we center the voices of those who are directly impacted by the outcomes of the design process. Okay. And so again, not only thinking about like sort of data science in the collection phase or the analysis phase or the process phase, but then also thinking about the communication of data. Sorry, there's an ambulance passing. I don't know if you can hear that. Also thinking about the communication of data in particular through the form of data visualization. So we have a chapter which is about the principle of elevating emotion and embodiment, where we talk at length about data visualization. And one of the things that we pull in from feminist theory is this very helpful move that feminist theorists do, which is that they challenge binaries. And in particular, feminist theorists challenge false binaries. And so there's an incredible amount of feminist work that's about the gender binary. And so what you might say about a feminist conception of the binary is that binaries are almost always hiding hierarchies, right? And if we think about the gender binary, that's true because, you might think, okay, we have men and we have women, but in fact, it's a hierarchy, right? It's men are on top, women are down here. And then what have we done with that gender binary? We have also erased trans and non-binary folks from that kind of very binary conception of gender. So it's both false binary, like it's empirically wrong, and it's an unequal hierarchy. And so it's good to be suspicious when you encounter this kind of binary thinking. And one of the places where we encounter this binary thinking is in the received wisdom about data visualization that we've inherited as data visualization has become a more popular form of communication. And so that comes in the form of the false binary between reason and emotion. So in an Anglo-Western context, at least, we've been taught that reason is somehow better than emotion. And we see this play out in the fact that data visualization, some of the top people in the field, this is changing, but some of the top people in the field have advocated for things like a minimalist aesthetic, a clean design, a kind of a just the facts approach, kind of a complete minimal approach and neutrality. But in the chapter, we question, why are these our best practices, right? Especially when recent research in information visualization has shown that we interpret these choices just as emotionally. So what about the opposite? So what about visualizations that directly leverage emotion? And so this is the example that we talk about in this chapter. So this is an example that is depicting gun deaths in the United States. It's an animated example, so each of these lines is actually animated. It unfolds over time. Each line represents a single human life, and at the point where the line changes from orange to gray is when that person's life is cut short. And so you can see that it will then, and then increases that statistic of how many people are killed on the left, and then on the right, it actually computes the quantity of stolen years. And so those are those gray years. And what they did with that is they used a statistical model to sort of guess or infer the years that particular person might have lived if they had not been killed by gun violence. And so this visualization, when it came out, it was viewed with suspicion by the visualization community because it was not neutral. It made us feel. It's directly making a kind of emotional appeal. It's framing years as being stolen from people, stolen from communities, stolen from families. It is different. It's like a kind of different register than this more kind of this era of active shooters visualization, which is just tabulating the number of shooting incidents, kind of similar topic, but it's this sort of generic bar chart kind of thing, but kind of very neutral heading. But in fact, a feminist approach here would say that this is not a problem at all, that we are directly engaging with emotion. And in fact, this is a more compelling visualization because it blends reason with emotion. So rebalancing emotion and reason opens up our data communication toolbox and allows us to focus on what really matters, which is honoring context, listening to experience, and so on. And in fact, you could even advance it to more ethical visualization because it's doing the emotional work of bearing witness to something as profound as this extreme loss of human life in a way that a bar chart potentially may be denying the humanity of folks represented just as these like sort of anonymous dots and numbers. Okay, one last example, and then I'll wind up and we can have some questions or discussion. Since y'all are a labor and tech group, I wanted to make sure to mention our last principle of our book. And so this is this idea of making labor visible. So in this chapter, we introduce readers to a lot of the feminist thinkers who have called our attention over the decades to undervalued forms of labor, which tend to be those types of labor which are either underwaged or not waged labor. So things like invisible labor, emotional labor, affective labor. And so again, while the tech marketing companies would have us believe that our data are light and airy and they float around in the cloud, the truth is exactly the opposite, right? Our data are heavy, they are resource intensive, they require huge buildings that have like huge environmental footprints, many megawatts of electricity, many staff members, human beings who work behind the scenes and who are mostly not credited with making the AI magic work. So much of the work that goes into designing our data products remains invisible and uncredited. And so like a feminist approach would seek to reverse that, to expose that, and to also appropriately credit that labor. And so what you're looking at here, which you can't even see because it's such a complex diagram, and we even in our book, we printed this diagram across 2 large pages, and you can still like barely read it. But this is a work called Anatomy of an AI System, which consists of this diagram by Vladan Joler, and then it's accompanied by an essay by Kate Crawford. And it's sort of simple premise that leads into this complete complexity. So they said, well, let's try to chart everything that goes into the production of an Amazon Echo device, this thing that you can talk to in your house and be like, hey, Alexa, like play a song, or hey, Alexa, order me some milk or whatever. And so they tried to like back that up even down to the sort of the natural resource level of like kind of which, like the lithium that is used in the batteries that are powering this thing, and chart all of these different sort of touch points for both planetary resources and human resources that go into this ostensibly simple device that Amazon would have you believe is seamless and exists in this cloud. And then here's this is a zoom into just like one tiny part of it. This is sort of inside Amazon. Once they're working on training data sets and things like this, and then they classify that there's unrecognized labor, unpaid and low paid labor, professionals, and even non-human labor sort of happening around doing all this training so that Alexa can respond to a single command. Okay, gonna wind up. Last thought here is just, it may be obvious from these examples, but data feminism really insists on an expanded definition of data science. And so this is important so that we can recognize the good work that's being done at the intersection of data and justice, but we wouldn't see it if we were only looking for it in university labs. So the data science we describe is not defined by the size of the data set. It's not defined by the credentials of the people undertaking the work. These are concerns that are continually used to exclude women and exclude people of color from the field, as well as to exclude work whose contribution is socio-technical rather than purely technical. But when we expand our definition of data science, then we can see that some of the most exciting work at this intersection of data science and justice is being done by artists, by journalists, by humanists, by community organizers, by activists, and more. And so what we do in the book is try to show many examples. I think we have like hundreds of examples in the book to try to illustrate these points and move folks to action. And because we really do think that, data is part of the root of many problems today, but it can also be part of the solution. Quick shout out, because I want to mention for the Portuguese speakers, we have data feminism infographics, and we just did a translation of them. And so we have a Portuguese version, Feminismo de Dados, which you can go download at this URL here. So it has the 7 principles as like a poster. We made it for an exhibition. And then it also has each principle as a series of like postcards with the description of the principle. So please go check those out. Feel free to share. And then please be in touch. Always happy to hear from folks. And yeah, thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for your amazing presentation. We will require a more broad data science and more broad feminism and communication research too. The first question is mine about some words seems to be progressive, but not really. What do you think about ethical AI efforts from big tech? Or how can this AI ethics agenda can reproduce inequalities and gender inequalities too?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think that's really important. I would say I have mixed feelings to a certain extent, because on the one hand, it's been very encouraging to see the tech community mobilized by ethical AI concerns. Like I'm really appreciating there's spaces like the fairness, accountability, transparency space, like these conferences that that particular conference actually is getting more and more interdisciplinary, which I think is very exciting. And then at the same time, there's these ways in which industry and narrowly technical fields dominating that conversation are leading to, again, very narrow and mathematical conceptions of fairness, which I think do have their place. Like there are certain things that we may be able to address through kind of mathematical solutions. But largely, many of the problems that we're facing with tech have very little to do with math. Like they have a lot to do with math in the sense that they have a lot to do with capitalism, maybe. And ultimately that's about math because it's about accumulating money. But but I think we can't necessarily we need to solve those problems with a much broader conversation. And I think like the ultimate hypocrisy of AI ethics is Google firing their top Black woman research scientist who's leading AI ethics. You know, like this to me is just utter hypocrisy and demonstrates the hollowness of what they mean by AI ethics and the narrow boundaries in which one is expected to operate within AI ethics. And it's worth noting, I only had the slide of Dr. Gebrus in the slideshow there, but Google actually also recently fired her co-lead, whose name is Margaret Mitchell, who's a white woman. She was just fired like last week or the week before as well. And so these two very top women scientists who were both leading on diversity, equity, and inclusion work within the corporation, and they were really leading on ethical AI and like thinking about what are the boundaries. Their paper that got retracted was about some of the environmental costs of large language models. And so it's very chilling that like Google's shutting down that kind of research and that kind of questioning, because that means it's really guiding the kinds of questions that are appropriate. And the kinds of questions that are appropriate are only the ones that will benefit the corporation. So I think like, you know, on the one hand, hopeful that these spaces are sort of multiplying and becoming more diverse and so on. And then on the other hand, certainly on the industry side, like, I don't think it's looking good right now. And I think that move by Google is going to have a chilling effect throughout the entire industry, or it'll have a backlash effect, which maybe that's good. So maybe we'll see some more productive stuff come from that.
Great. The next question is from Adriana.
Hi, Catherine. Great talk. I was thinking about, I would like to come back to the intersectionality concept again, because usually when we talk about intersectionality and data or algorithm, we always talk about gender, class, and race that are like classic categories in like sociology, media studies, humanities. And how do you see, how can we incorporate like other categories like age and neurodivergence in relation to data and data collective? That's it.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I think that brings up a really important question. And of course, I think you're right to point out that those are the classic examples. You know, I think intersectionality comes from a consideration of race and gender. So that's in a way, it's like origin point. But then folks have definitely expanded it to think about other dimensions of identity. And so I think, again, it becomes kind of a contextual question. So actually one of the principles I didn't talk about is to consider context, which so often we lack when we're working with a big data set we downloaded online or something like that. We don't know where it came from or what it's connected to or who was the community, how did they collect the data, et cetera. But this is where the context of the work comes into play. And by that I mean, like, this is why it's so important to examine power, because in any given context, different axes of domination are going to be more salient. So in some contexts, race might be like the most salient thing, whereas in another context, maybe it is neurodivergence. Like if that's an area that you're studying, or that's a community that you're working with, like that maybe is the most salient dimension of sort of privilege and oppression, for example, or age. Let's say folks who are working, for example, with seniors on mobile health technologies and things like this. Like I was just actually here in the United States, I just read an article recently about, so all these states are releasing COVID vaccine websites. They're all terribly unusable. And the populations they're trying to turn out to get the vaccination are all 75 plus and often have, you know, vision impairments and various kinds of things. And so like, there's this like real mismatch here between designing the technologies for the people who most need them and understanding how to be inclusive and accessible to their needs. So I think that's where like that idea of both the examining power in whatever the context is, looking at those different intersecting dimensions of identity, whatever they might be, and then proceeding from there with the sensitivity to what those are. Because we can't be including all of those all at the same time. And I think certain ones are going to be emergent as the more appropriate and salient focuses in any given context.
Great, thank you so much, Catherine. The next question is from Cruzcaya Hidalgo, an amazing colleague from Ecuador who researched feminism and decolonial perspective. He will enter. Hello, Cruzcaya, nice to see you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Rafael, for inviting me last minute. I'm super honored to be with you, Catherine, and can speak and pursue these questions. So just to let you know, I'm a feminist as well in Ecuador, and we are part of a project here in Ecuador that calls Platform Observatory. So we're also working with data, but mostly with workers. So mostly delivery on demand workers. And in our work, we are very focused in create and pursue a feminist methodology, also intersectional and decolonial methodology. So, and that's gonna be my question for you. When we're thinking about data feminism, and you were mentioning these 7 principles of values, where the methodology will be, in the sense of, it's not just how we collect data or from whom or why, but also how we create these connections with people. How people is gonna see the data that is after publication or writing is a way that the individuals, that the people are gonna feel represent there, and is any way that they can also collaborate and almost contradict your interpretation of them. So that's like in a methodology where it's gonna be there, that. And my second question in feminism as well is where can we put reproduction work and reproduction labor on this data feminism? Because you were putting some super interesting and important questions before of who are doing the work and the data for whom, whose values. But I think that also the question is, who is sustaining that labor after all? Like, who is making possible that someone thinks about data and work in data? And I think that most of the people that are sustaining the houses and sustaining the life of the workers and the scientists and the researchers are women. So where we can put those questions? Thank you again.
Thanks, Cruzcaya. One more question is a similar question from Maria Collier. How do you connect mother work, motherhood, and mothering with data feminism issues? I think is this. The floor is yours, Catherine.
Wow, these are amazing questions. So I'll try to sort of answer them in order, but maybe connect them also. I was writing them down. I think what you were mentioning about the process is so important. And the place where we address this most fully, although still only like a chapter, is in the Embrace Pluralism principle, where it's really talking about like, and trying to give examples of how do we do participatory process around data science. And there are a couple of examples there. But this is a deep concern, I would say, because I think the hierarchies are very real. And it's also why we need to train our focus on this kind of relationship building, but also capacity building. And for me, so a kind of strand of my other work also involves data literacy work, because thinking about like, how do we work with folks so that they understand enough of the tools, both the risks of doing work with data, but also the what the affordances of collecting, analyzing, dealing with data sets might be. And so we talk a good amount in the book also about teaching and ways that we might sort of challenge the common ways that we teach about data science, so that it's not just, again, that extractivist model of the academic researchers like going into communities, collecting their data, returning to the academy, writing it up for a research paper, and then like never returning again. And so in the book, we try to show like sort of what does the opposite of that model look like? That model is the norm. And so what does the opposite of that look like? And so I think the opposite looks like, we feature the work of the anti-eviction mapping project, for example. And so that's like a community organizing project, which involves actually a good amount of academics, but operating more with their organizer hats on, where they're looking to they work in coalition with tenants' rights and housing organizations to collect and depict the scale of the eviction crisis in different US cities. And it's very grounded, very community-based work. It includes oral histories and this kind of community sense-making. It includes literacy work and capacity building, and sort of mutual benefit and like deep collaboration. It's not about someone getting tenure at their university, And so I think those provide these powerful models for how we can cultivate that kind of participatory process. But recognize it's like really not the norm. There are fields where participation is more the norm, but data science is like definitely not one of those. So I think whatever it is, it has to involve like a displacing of power from the people who think they have all the power, which are usually the academic elites, a setting up of governance and accountability structures so that they can truly be held accountable to the community, and then this sort of data literacy capacity building element as well, but done in a non-paternalistic way. On the reproduction, I think is so interesting. I love this question. What it made me think of, which we talk about, is we talk about in the context chapter, I think, is actually though there is a whole profession of people that work to care for and maintain data sets, and they're librarians, they're like librarians and archivists. And so it's a profession that they are like stewards of data sets, and they care deeply about really nerdy, awesome things like metadata and data dictionaries and things like this. And so in a way, that's like librarians and information science, I think, is a whole group of folks that, again, should be part of these conversations and don't tend to be part of these conversations, and don't tend to be capacitated with the resources and the funding. But they are the people who are the stewards of our information, and they care for it, they tend to it, they garden the information and keep the data repositories alive and usable, and upgrade the servers when there's a new software update. Like this is all the like boring maintenance work of information management, and it doesn't tend to be talked about as being so sexy as AI, but it's essential. So that's sort of where I went with that one. And I love the mothering one, and like I actually think and this maybe relates to the reproduction question too. So I've gone on to do work working with some of the activists who are collecting data about feminicide, folks like Maria Salguero, who there's actually a lot of them. There's folks in Brazil, we've interviewed some, and so many of them talk about the databases they're building as care. So they're caring, like their act of putting a person's name and their details in this database is a form of witnessing and memorializing and caring for the memory of this person. And so I actually feel that this kind of we've really overlooked this idea of care in data, but like sort of data management and data collection and analysis and so on. And so I think like kind of coming back to those questions of reproduction, or thinking about how, what is that connection of like caring for a database, or caring even for an individual row in a database. Like that's what the activists have described to us. And so that's to me a little bit where the mothering connection comes in. And then there is in the book a little bit about a feminist hackathon that I ran that was explicitly about breastfeeding and postpartum time period as well. So there is a very direct connection, literally, to mothering there as well. So, thank you for those great questions.
Great. Our last question, Catherine, is from another professor of UNISINOS here in Brazil, from Maria Clara Aquino. Here in Brazil, the problem of sub-notification of feminicide is huge. How do you think that media can help to fix this lack of data? And do you think that journalism has a social function in this problem?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And actually, in fact, we've now interviewed 15 different projects. 2 were in Brazil, a bunch were in other countries in Latin America, and then 3 were in the United States, and 1 in Spain, actually. In many cases, not all cases, but many of the folks who are doing these projects are journalists. Either they're officially working for a paper and they do it as a journalistic project for that news outlet, or they sort of did it as a side project, but they have prior training as journalists. And so in fact, I think that I think journalists have a huge role to play, and are doing it already, where they're scanning the news and they are collecting cases from the news, and then they're often using those data to hold folks accountable. They're going, actually, there's a project in Brazil that we interviewed, Uma por Uma, and they became a really important information conduit point. Like they worked directly with local officials. They often would like know more about, they would follow cases more closely than the law enforcement was following, for example. So I think I see a lot of potential for journalism to play a role, even as I want to acknowledge that journalism is a source of a problematic in a lot of ways too, because the media tend to report on feminicide across all countries in a very biased and stereotypical way. But many of the folks who are doing the data collection projects kind of, they see those stereotypes and look past them, but more use the articles as a source of kind of case building for their databases. So yeah, thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Catherine, for your amazing presentation and great answers too. A last talk about from Kruskaya, Mimi Unoha, missing data archive is so connected to reproductive labor too. Who's making possible data research at the end of the day? And where should we put reproduction labor on this debate? And data feminism from below and from the global south too. It's many possibles of research and action for us. Thank you so much. I hope you can come to Brazil, and we are very happy to be together in a same research network, Labor Tech research network. I don't know if Adriana can ask some question or say another word.
No, just to thank Catherine in the name of UNISINOS and Programa de Pós-Graduação em Comunicação. And hope you can be in Brazil and we can travel again to conferences soon.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See you there. Para quem está assistindo, muito obrigado por participar de mais uma live. No mês de abril, a gente vai organizar um evento sobre inteligência artificial. Eu, a professora Adriana, a professora Maria Clara, a gente vai anunciar em breve, nos dias 19 e 20 de abril, Histórias da Inteligência Artificial, Diálogo Sul e Norte. E muito obrigado pela presença. Tchau.
Tchau.